The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Martha Bullen. I'm Eileen Cavanaugh from Hennepin County Library Program Office, and my guest today is Martha Bullen, author of Staying Home, From Full-Time Professional to Full-Time Parent. Welcome, Martha.
Thank you, Eileen.
So, Martha, you're a stay-at-home mom. What do you do all day?
Well, it's a good question. People ask that often about how mothers. They don't really understand what's involved in the job. I guess part of what I do is I care for my two children. My daughter's nearly 4 and I have a 7-month-old baby. And then I try to fit in some things for myself. I wrote this book over a period of several months during my daughter's nap time, and I'm an active member of a mother support group called Female.
Which all goes to show that even with 2 small children, if you really want to do something like write a book, you can do it.
You can do it. It's not easy. You only get little tiny segments of time to do things in rather than whole uninterrupted hours. You don't have those luxuries. But if you know what you want to do and set some goals, then it can be done.
Good idea of a success story for a working at home mom.
That's right.
I was curious to find the statistics that you quoted in the book saying that in 1948, when the Labor Department first started to collect statistics, we had an upward swing of percentage of women in the workforce until the present time, and now we are experiencing a drop in the percentage of women working.
That's right.
So was it this trend that got you thinking about writing the book?
Yes, it is. And really they said women are leaving the workforce primarily to have children. I've been asked, is it because of the current economic situation? Are they just losing their jobs? But really, the analysts say most of it is women of childbearing years who are choosing to have children and then deciding to be home. And we noticed that trend, and we thought there really ought to be a book for those women who had been career women and used to that kind of life and are suddenly making the transition to the home can be a big life change, and we wanted to offer some help in that transition.
In the 80s, it seems to me as if one almost felt guilty if one was not working.
Very true.
Is there something that has the psychology of all this changed for women?
Not really. Unfortunately, there's a lot of guilt floating around. I think women on both sides, if you will, often wonder, am I making the right choice? There's concern about their children, there's concern about themselves, whether they're wasting their education. I still think there's a lot of people who think that at-home mothers don't work. They think you're sitting there with the television on all day and that you're not doing something that's worthwhile. And that's an unfortunate thing because those stereotypes really are not true, and they can be damaging to people's self-esteem who are doing the work at home.
Well, to go back to your mentioning wasting time, education is very expensive today. What about the people who would say, well, it is a waste of time if you've gotten an expensive education to just sit at home with your children?
Well, you might hear that. In fact, I have a degree from Carleton College, which isn't a bad one, but I think that it really depends how you intend to use it. Some people have told us that we surveyed that said that they thought the most valuable thing they could do with their mind in education was to help raise their children and teach them about the world. I also want to point out to people that this is only one stage of your life, that usually most of the women have built up a career. They spend several years using that education in the workplace and developing skills. Then they stay home often for several years. The average time of the women we surveyed is about 4.5 years during the preschool time. And then, without exception, they tend to get back into the workforce, either full-time or part-time. So it's not as though this life change lasts forever. People aren't staying home for 20 years anymore. They're just taking a break and raising their children in those formative years, and then they will use their skills again.
So we're looking at kind of an in-out situation of women in the workforce.
We certainly are, and I'd like to point out people who think that it's an either-or choice, that you either work full-time or you stay home full-time, are really missing the point. Most women are doing both things at different stages of their lives, as their children are born or as they grow older. They can accomplish both things in their lives, and there's no reason to judge others who've chosen differently, because often you may end up switching roles somewhere along the line.
Well, true, and that seems to be happening in the '92 political campaign, where Hillary Clinton and Marilyn Quayle are sort of examples of women who did different things, different ways of combining raising children and having careers. And where it's, as you say, they're just slightly different ways of accomplishing that. Many women, many of the media and the parties seem to be pitting them against one another as opposite approaches.
Right. And I really dislike the divisiveness that sometimes the media portrays something called the mommy wars, which is an irritating term in itself, that implies that those who work out of the home and those who work in the home are at war with each other. And I think it's nonsense. It's just, there may be an element of defensiveness that sometimes, or self-doubt that these women may have, but I do not believe that there's a full-scale war. I think the more women can join together, the more they might get government and business to do some helpful things for families in general. If we're not pitted against each other, we can unite and get some helpful changes made in terms of flexible work opportunities or parental leave, some things that would help parents in general. So I really hope women will not be divided on this issue.
So is Female, the organization you belong to, engaged in just those kinds of things, helping women to...
It is. Female is an interesting acronym. When it started 5 years ago, it stood for Formerly Employed Mothers at Loose Ends, because that's just the way the founder felt, and that's the way many women feel once they first stay home. And they think, you know, where am I? Who am I now? What do I do now? And then as they are home, they grow more confident with their roles and more comfortable with who they are. So we changed the organization's name last year to reflect that change, and it's now entitled Formerly Employed Mothers at the Leading Edge, which is very positive, and it also reflects some of these social changes we've discussed. And Female offers a national support group for mothers, both to find moral support by joining together at groups and having adult conversation, and it also does some political advocacy in terms of parents' rights.
And it sounds as if that change in name reflects a growth, perhaps, of its membership, too.
Precisely.
From just being at loose ends.
Yes, and the group was founded 5 years ago in the Chicago area. It's based in Elmhurst, Illinois. And it now has 1,200 members across the country and over 50 active chapters, including one in Minneapolis. So that's been quite a success story itself.
Well, and if you are a model of the kind of staying-at-home mother, it seems to me, in a sense, you are a staying-at-home mother raising your children. But in another sense, you're really an entrepreneur, and you're running a business out of your home.
Exactly. And in fact, 20% of the women we surveyed 600 at-home mothers across the country, 20% of them have started or plan to start an at-home business. Both to help get that extra salary, you know, it helps to bring in some more money into the family, and also to use their professional skills and feel as though they're not, you know, losing too much ground in their career while they're at home.
What happened, do you think, to make women value time with their children more than 2 paychecks?
I think in some ways it's the pendulum shifting from the last decade. People were working so hard. They were working 60 and 80-hour work weeks in the 80s, and the idea was climbing that career ladder and making more money and buying more things. And I think people finally sat back and thought, wait a minute, you know, I don't have any time for myself. I don't have any time for my family. Is this what I want to do with my life? And more women are, there's a baby boomlet going on. More women of the baby boom age are getting to the point where they want children and they're beginning to think, you know, do they want to completely miss that time with them, or do they want to make some time for them in their lives? So I think in some ways it's a reaction to the 80s. We're finding a more sensible balance between work and family.
I was wondering, as you were saying that, though, whether women sort of trade one set of stressors for another. Did some women work outside the home in the 80s and feel stressed by the long days and the childcare and all that sort of thing? And decide, well, I'll try staying at home, and now they're involved in a 14-hour day at home. And
yes, that's real true. I mean, neither job is easy, and as you say, about half of the women we surveyed say they work about 14 hours or more a day, which is why I like to laugh when people say you don't work. It's like, well, yes, I'm working most of the day, I'm just not getting paid for it.
And in fact, some other studies I've read said that women still, most women still do not get a lot of help, whether they work outside the home or inside the home.
I'm afraid it's true. In terms of household chores, it's a big thorny issue, and particularly for those spouses when they both had outside jobs, often there's at least some participation by the husband, because obviously the wife isn't there, and he needs to pitch in and do his share. And suddenly when she's home, it's as though they're falling back into old sex-role patterns that they grew up with, and suddenly she's responsible for everything in the house, and he is responsible for bringing home the paycheck. This sounds fine in theory, but in practice it means she can be working around the clock and exhausted and resentful. And I think in a good marriage it really makes sense to have more of a teamwork approach, to let the father have a chance at more hands-on child care, to get more comfortable in his role as a parent, and also to take some of those yucky chores that have to be done. There's no reason it should be all her job, because face it, most of the women are there for their children. They're there to raise them and bring them up and spend time with them and enjoy them, and not to spend all the time doing laundry or scrubbing the floors.
What happens to the woman who worked out, professional woman who worked outside the home and was a feminist and believed in the women's movement? And now she decides to stay at home, and especially transitionally when she's first at home. Have you interviewed women who felt a change in that aspect of their lives too? Who felt they were frustrated feminists now?
Yes, in some ways. Some people feel a little bit upset at the feminist movement has often ignored at-home mothers, or in fact denigrated them. I mean, in the 50s, Betty Friedan's book was pretty much, the message was, if you're at home, I think she called women parasites, suburban parasites, and that you ought to be in the workplace. And
she later regretted it.
She later regretted it. She retracted it in her book, saying, wait a minute, what about the children? And we forgot about that. But I have to say that you can be a feminist and a mother at home too, without question. Many of the women are. We have 4 ground rules in our book, and the 4th ground rule is consider yourself a feminist. And by that we mean that you should value a woman's work wherever she does it, if it's in the office or if it's at home caring for her family, that it's important, meaningful work. And we'd like women to think of themselves in a proud way. The work they're doing is important, and also to value the work that other women are doing. In that sense, you really can be a feminist at home. But some people would like to see the feminist movement pay more attention to women at home, that they are also fully sisters, the members of the movement, and that the work they're doing does matter.
Is female working at that too, to have the women's movement pay more attention to that?
Not in itself. What they're really trying to get the message across to society as a whole, that at-home mothers are a large group, and that they're worthy of respect, and that they're contributing to our society.
You mentioned ground rules. Tell us about, because there were more than, I think there were 4 ground rules.
Yes, there were. We came up with these ground rules based on what all these women in our surveys told us that they used for their coping strategies, what helped them when they were at home, and we wanted to pass those along to other women. The first one is know what you want your job to be. And that is, don't let other people's expectations define you. Don't let them assume you're going to be a happy homemaker if that's not what you like. You can choose how to use your time at home, whether you do start an at-home business or get involved in community work or teach your children, do homeschooling. Some of the women we talk to do that. You can choose. It's up to you to define your role, and in some ways that's very freeing. Particularly once you get outside of other people's expectations.
I wish I had known that rule
when
I was a young homemaker, because I thought what I was supposed to be was a good housekeeper and have the house all clean when my husband came home.
Right.
And I didn't like it very much.
Probably not. It's not very interesting in itself. I don't enjoy it. But I think sometimes women can fall into that trap. They think, well, I'm home, everything has to be perfect. The house has to be perfect, my child has to be perfect. That isn't realistic. But there are other people who are sort of putting that burden on them. And we want to free people from that and say, if you don't mind a dirty house and you're accomplishing something more interesting, or you're just spending meaningful time with your child, great, do it. Do what feels right. And our second ground rule is acknowledge your skills. That is, that all your skills in education do not disappear along with your last paycheck. You still have them, and you can still use them in raising your children and in contributing to your community. And then our third ground rule is validate yourself. And that means there are people out there who'll put you down, so go out and find people who will affirm the work you're doing, who understand, women who are doing the same things, or who respect what you're doing. But that's where joining a support group like Female, or finding a neighborhood play group, or just neighbors is terribly important. You have to have some sympathetic friends who are there when you need adult company. and then the feminist rule. So I think all of those things, they're not easy to accomplish, they take some effort, but I think they really will be helpful for women as they make this transition.
When you talk about skills transfer, I was thinking that, well, it's fine for a woman who's a nurse or a teacher. I can definitely see where that skill would transfer. But what about women who were lawyers or actors or models or editors?
Well, those are good questions, but I talked with women of all walks. I said, how do you use your skills at home? I got all sorts of interesting answers. One woman was a graphics designer. She said she spent her time making her son's room just the most beautiful decorations for his room, and sewing quilts not only for him but then that she sold for other people, baby quilts. As some managers said, they really use their time at home in sort of organizing the family household and supervising their children and budgeting and planning ahead. Those are all skills that they've learned on the job. I did have a nurse who said that she actually saved her son from choking by using the Heimlich maneuver on him. So you can, and others like lawyers or bookkeepers may use their skills not directly for their child, but by doing consulting work out of their home to bring in some extra money while they're home. So there really is any number of things that can be done. You can just use your imagination in terms of how to best use your time while you're at home.
Does it work the other way too when the woman, now it has for me, I think, when the woman goes back to her job after having spent some time raising her children, are there some skills she carries that she never knew she had?
Very much so. We also asked that question, and the number one skill was patience. Everybody said they didn't know the meaning of the word patience until they had to deal with infants and toilet training 2-year-olds and the whole range of childhood crises. Patience is a terribly important skill. They also, that we talked about organizing, that they really learned how to juggle their different responsibilities in the household and balance conflicting personalities. They said really in terms of communicating interpersonal skills, they became a great deal stronger at those. All of these sound a little amorphous, but they're all things that are valued highly in managers and in other professionals, and you do develop skills along those lines, as well as, of course, things like nursing and child development and you know, other kinds of skills along those lines.
I've noticed that in being on the other side of the interview table that women now seem to feel more free to mention being at home and being a homemaker as a skill that they bring to their jobs, that women are becoming more conscious and more, I think maybe even as little as 5 or 10 years ago, most women would have been slightly embarrassed to mention that their background was one of homemaker.
Well, I think it's wonderful to say that. If you have a gap on your resume, rather than saying I was unemployed or I'm just a housewife, I think those are putting yourself down. It's a good thing to say I was actively involved in raising my children. I put a lot of energy into that, and now I'm ready to turn my skills back into the workplace again. And also, most of the women we spoke with did community work, often got involved in boards of directors and really high-level positions in their communities. That's also important to mention at an interview. Those are valuable things that an employer will look at.
And perhaps saw a need in their community and formed a group to meet the need, which is a real upper management kind of skill.
It absolutely is, and also our communities could not survive without the work of women at home, both in terms of running local park districts and libraries and the school systems. I understand that parents contribute an enormous amount to schools that have budget crises. They go in and donate their time and give lectures and bake cookies and teach art classes. They're just terribly important in the successful running of our schools.
Give us a profile of some interesting 90s women who have had interesting ways of making that transition from work to home.
Well, I'm not sure I know what your question is.
Tell us about some of the more interesting women you interviewed and how they managed that transition.
Sure. Well, there's one that came to mind of a woman when she made the decision to stay home. She was a very high-ranking editor-in-chief at a magazine for attorneys, and she really loved her job, but she said she used to feel an incredible amount of satisfaction every month when the magazine was in her hands and she'd done it from start to finish and it was produced. But she found that one day she came home to see her little boy, and his face at the window filled her with much more joy than holding that magazine, and she said that was the time she realized that where she really wanted to be was at home. Her story stuck with me because sometimes it's a matter of trusting your instincts and knowing that the stage is right, that you've accomplished what you wanted to at work, you've enjoyed that part of your life, and now it's time to move on and try full-time parenting for a while.
What's your experience, Martha, of staying at home now? You must have gone through a period of making the decision, staying at home, and then deciding to write a book.
It's really been one of the most fulfilling parts of my life. I worked in publishing for 6 years, and then just before my daughter was born, I stayed home. She's nearly 4. And I enjoyed the work I did. It was challenging and interesting, but I have had so much more control over my own life since then. Not only have I written this book and enjoyed raising my daughter and now my baby son, but I've also, as I said, was on the board of directors of Female and did consulting to small publishers, and I published a book of poems by a friend, and I did it from start to finish. I took the manuscript and ended up with a finished book. These are not things I could have done while in the workforce full time. There wouldn't have been the time or the energy. And I've just been delighted with this aspect of my life. I don't think that I want to give it up to return to full-time work, in fact, for a very long time. It's just been rewarding and liberating and interesting. And I'm going to try to stay at home even when my children are older and work out of my home office and be flexible enough to be there for them, but also to not have a boss, to choose my own working hours and subjects.
I'm not sure you've studied these women long enough, but do you think this will be a future trend, that women will like it so well that they will probably never return to the
Well, I
workforce?
think so. We have a last chapter about what are your options in returning to work, and these include part-time work and telecommuting and home office and some of the other things we mentioned. And by far the most popular option was working for themselves. That one person said, "I'll never punch a time clock again," and they just really found the idea of getting up every morning early and putting on pantyhose and fighting the traffic and being told what to do by someone else. Many of them did not relish that idea again, and they were trying to find creative, flexible ways of avoiding it, and many of them have done so. They've started new careers for themselves using either their professional skills or hobbies that they enjoy. And they're going in an exciting new direction. I'd like to mention a couple of those things. One of my friends is an accountant, but she's always enjoyed cooking. She started her own catering service from her home and is finding that very fulfilling. Another woman makes dollhouse furniture, said it was a hobby, and she made it for friends, and now she's got a successful business at it. Those are just 2 examples of the things you can do, and they may not be as lucrative as working full-time, but they can often be more fun, and they still mean that you can be there much of the time for your children, which again is the goal of most of the mothers.
And actually, if they're more satisfying, studies have shown with men and women that the money one makes from a job is usually less of a motivating force than the satisfaction that is felt with a job. So it sounds as if money in many cases would not be the...
Right. If you're fortunate enough to have, a primary breadwinner that brings in enough money, and not everybody is in that position, but if you can choose, I think that most of the women we surveyed found that this was the choice that they enjoyed, and staying home they're really happy they did it. In fact, 97% of them said if they had to choose, they would do it all over again. That's a rather stunning figure.
Wonderful, yes. Probably more so than people who are at work.
I think so.
Do you think this trend, if it continues as a trend, will force business people, employers, to be more flexible in their job hours to attract women
I think
back
it
to
will.
the
It's beginning to
workforce?
happen already. Women will make up the majority of the workforce within a few years, and they're going to have to do some things to retain good employees. I'd like to see much more done right now and regarding flexible work, maternity and paternity leaves of a adequate duration. 4 to 6 weeks is not enough time to spend with a baby. You're barely recovered from childbirth, let alone
Right.
having time to develop a relationship. I'd love to see 6 months to a year, that possibility for both parents to take. And I'd like to see more options to allow people to fit both work and family in their lives, not one to the exclusion of the other. And I do think some companies are beginning to offer that, but I think a lot more remains to be done.
Perhaps they will see that the women are developing really valuable skills that they would like to have back in the workforce.
I think so.
Another thing I was wondering about is how all this affects the consumer market. I'm thinking that professional women and their families are probably used to going to the theater, eating out.
Right.
my guess is that a lot of this stops when you're at home.
It sure does. Usually you need to cut back, and often it works the best in terms of a family's finances if you plan ahead as far as possible. If you can start banking one of your incomes even before the baby arrives, start paying off your debts. Perhaps don't choose the most expensive house or apartment you can afford, but find one that is more affordable on one income. You will cut back a little bit, but many people found that to be rewarding. They said it was kind of nice to see that they could have a strong family life without blatant consumerism and without having to work so many hours just to buy things, that there was a sense of just rediscovering their family and their enjoyment, that they didn't have to be out spending money and doing things all the time.
In fact, I think you mentioned one family who sold their large house and bought a more modest one so that the mortgage payments would be...
Exactly. And you know, in some ways you might call this a sacrifice, but in other ways it's they consider it, the trade-offs are well worth it, that it would enable them to give up one job by making those decisions to be there for the children.
Well, it sounds as if it's a matter of changing values then, that people are seeing a real investment in their own children as being more valuable than an investment in, well, I don't know whether I want to go so far as to say this, but an investment in their career or a monetary investment having.
I think it's very much involved with values. You hear a lot about family values these days in the political campaign. It's a little amorphous. Nobody knows quite what it means. But if you say that it means that they value their children and it's important to spend that time with them rather than giving them things, giving them the gift of themselves, I think that we are seeing more of that now. I think it's a good change.
It is. I think maybe we've gone through that decade of the 80s that was sort of the what's in it for me kind of decade too, and maybe this is a symbol of it, that women are thinking, hey, there's more to just us. There are children, and these are our children are our future.
Well, exactly. And the other thing to remember is it doesn't last forever. They're young for not a very long time. It really does fly by. And you can take that time out and be there for them, get them off to a great start. And then you've got the work world waiting for you. Some women can go back for another 30 years. You know, it's not the end of your career. Some people have that misconception. It's just one stage of it.
In fact, I think you quoted from a member of Female saying that a woman's life expectancy is 76 years, and if she thinks of this in terms of maybe 5 to even 10 years spent at home with her children, it still allows her a significant portion of her life to be left. And I'm afraid that we don't have a significant portion of time left. So I do want to thank you for coming, Martha.
Thank you, Eileen.
It's been fun having you, and fun to talk about staying home. And I hope our viewers will enjoy looking at staying home.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.